I don't believe that a man owes the rest of his life to a particular team. You know, I've given up a certain amount of my time for the Lakers and for the league, and under their roles. I also believe that now I'm a free agent to do what I want. I have an answer. I've already sent a letter to the Lakers and to the league stating that if they own me, well, then pay me, and I'm going to come in there and see whether they want me to play for them. I tried 2 years ago to come in and play for them, and they disallowed me to play for them.
He was unstoppable, a man built like a myth, 7'1", 300 pounds of pure dominance. He once dropped 100 points in a single game. He led the league in scoring, rebounding, assists, and ruled the paint like a king guarding his throne. But for all of Wilt Chamberlain's records, power, and brilliance, he was also one of the most misunderstood legends the game has ever seen.
I believe that the world is extraordinary, you know, and I'm really pretty ordinary. But it's how people view you, you know. One of the things that always bothered me was people always wondered, well, where do you sleep? How big is the bed that you sleep in? You know, it never bothered me. It was pretty easy just to curl up and go to sleep. But people view you in a certain way, and because you're a foot taller or so than the average guy, to them that foot sometimes is 5 or 6. An old lady once asked me how tall I was, and I said 6'11". I was in high school at the time, and she said I just lied to her like you couldn't believe. She said, you got to be 9 feet tall. Well, people see you as being something much more than what I see myself as being.
Because beneath the stats and spotlight, Wilt hated being disrespected. He hated being overshadowed. And more than anything, he hated those who dared to challenge his legacy, physically, emotionally, or politically. These weren't just on-court rivalries. They were personal, they were psychological, and for Wilt, they ran deep. Today, we're breaking down the 6 players Wilt Chamberlain hated the most, from bitter enemies to those who threatened his crown, one clash at a time. But before proceeding, please take a second and subscribe, and like this video, it will be very motivation for us. Wilt Chamberlain never passed the torch, not to anyone, not willingly. And that's exactly why Kareem Abdul-Jabbar's rise into the NBA wasn't just a generational shift, it was a declaration, one that Chamberlain took personally. By the time Kareem entered the league in 1969, Wilt was already a god. He'd shattered records, carried teams, and owned nearly every stat category worth mentioning. But as his career entered its twilight, a new prototype was emerging. Taller, smoother, colder. Kareem was 7 feet 2 inches, with the most unstoppable weapon the league had ever seen, the skyhook. And he wasn't coming to pay homage. He was coming for the throne. Their first official matchup happened during Kareem's rookie season, and it was tense from the jump. Wilt, then 33 and recovering from a torn patellar tendon, faced the 22-year-old phenom in what felt more like a torch fight than a torch passing. Kareem dropped 31 points and 17 rebounds. Wilt, just 12 and 9. The message was clear. The kid wasn't just talented, he was here to embarrass you. Wilt hated it, because while most rookies came into the league showing reverence, Kareem wasn't built like that. He was quiet, but he wasn't submissive. He didn't dap Wilt up. He didn't ask for wisdom. He just got to work, night after night, posting up, carving space, and flicking skyhooks over everyone, including Chamberlain. Wilt, who always saw himself as the most physically gifted man in the game, now had to contend with someone taller, longer, and in some ways, more refined. That stung, and it turned every meeting into a psychological war. They faced off 17 times in the regular season. Over those matchups, Kareem averaged 31.8 points and 15.8 rebounds. Wilt, in contrast, put up 16.3 points and 17.6 rebounds. But stats didn't tell the whole story. What Wilt hated wasn't just that Kareem scored, it's how he scored. The skyhook wasn't violent or flashy. It was surgical, impersonal. There was no fire in Kareem's eyes, no drama, no fear, just execution. And it drove Wilt crazy. In public, Wilt took jabs, sometimes subtle, sometimes sharp. He questioned Kareem's leadership, said he was aloof, criticized his conditioning. At one point, Wilt even told reporters that Kareem's skyhook was boring and that real big men don't rely on finesse.
I watch Kareem out there now. I think the center position has suffered. I think they have lousy centers right now. There are 2 or 3 who are any good. The rest of them couldn't make Overbrook High School.
And you still talk about Kareem as the guy that just doesn't do it for the rebounds. I don't know how much of that is needle. I don't know.
Well, some of it's needle, but he can still go out there and do it scoring-wise on these guys who, you know, should be killing him up and down the court or what have you. That's because I believe they have athletic ability, but they don't use this right up here.
It was petty, but it came from a place of real insecurity. Because deep down, Wilt saw his legacy slipping. The league wasn't talking about 100-point games anymore. They were marveling at Kareem's skyhook, his grace, his ceiling. And Wilt? He hated playing second to anyone. One of their most important matchups came during the 1972 Western Conference Finals, Wilt's Lakers versus Kareem's Bucks. Kareem was the reigning MVP. Wilt was 35, playing with a torn ligament in his wrist. But despite the odds, Wilt's Lakers won the series in 6 games. It was the last great stand of the old giant, and he treated it that way, playing with a fire he hadn't shown in years, muscling Kareem out of the paint, grabbing 24 rebounds in the closeout game. For Wilt, that series wasn't just about making the finals. It was about reminding Kareem and the world who built the kingdom. But even in that triumph, the rivalry never softened. Years later, when Kareem passed Wilt on the all-time scoring list, Wilt refused to celebrate him. He downplayed the accomplishment, said it was a product of longevity, not greatness. And when asked directly if Kareem was better, Wilt never once said yes. Kareem, for his part, rarely responded. He didn't trade insults, didn't defend himself. But that only made Wilt more frustrated, because he couldn't drag Kareem into a public war. And without that war, Wilt couldn't control the narrative. Even decades later, when most players had patched up their beefs, Wilt kept that wall up. In interviews, he'd praise Russell. He'd acknowledge guys like Elgin or Baylor. But Kareem, the compliments were always muted, reluctant, distant. Because to Wilt, Kareem wasn't just the guy who followed him. He was the player who made Wilt feel replaceable. And for a man who had spent his entire life proving he was one of one, that was unforgivable. There were no elbows, no trash talk, no fights in the tunnel or quotes in the papers. But make no mistake, Wilt Chamberlain hated Bill Russell, not because of a single moment, but because of everything Russell represented. By the time Wilt entered the NBA in 1959, he was already a walking myth, the most dominant force the league had ever seen. He scored 30 points in his first professional game. He dropped 55 rebounds on Bill Russell in a single night. He once averaged over 48 minutes per game. These weren't just numbers, they were declarations. He wasn't trying to be better than everyone. He was trying to end the debate, and yet Russell kept beating him. Over the course of their 10-year rivalry, Wilt and Russell faced off 142 times. Russell's Celtics won 86 of those meetings, including 7 of 8 playoff series. To Chamberlain, it was maddening. He'd pour in 40, 50, sometimes 60 points, only to walk off the floor while the guy with 12 points and 20 rebounds celebrated another win. Russell was everything Wilt wasn't, and that's exactly why the rivalry cut so deep. Wilt was about dominance, raw numbers, historical feats. Russell was about sacrifice, culture, winning at all costs. Where Wilt saw basketball as a canvas to showcase individual greatness, Russell saw it as a test of discipline, strategy, and trust. And every time the Celtics eliminated one of Wilt's teams, whether it was the Warriors, the Sixers, or the Lakers, it deepened the wound. Wilt was often accused of not caring enough about winning. He hated that, but he also hated that Russell's reputation for winning seemed to erase his own brilliance. No one could stop Wilt, except Bill Russell, and even that wasn't true on the stat sheet. Over their head-to-head matchups, Wilt averaged 28.7 points and 28.7 rebounds. Russell, by comparison, averaged 14.5 points and 23.7 rebounds. But basketball doesn't happen in a vacuum, and that's what made it so frustrating. Wilt could tower over Russell, outscore him, outjump him, and still lose. And Russell knew it. Not in an arrogant way, but in a quiet, deliberate way that drove Wilt crazy. He never boasted, never flinched, never retaliated. He just stood there as if to say, "You may be bigger, but I'm better." One of Wilt's most revealing quotes came years later when he said, "They say I lost to Russell. I didn't lose to Russell. I lost to the Celtics." But that was the problem. Bill Russell was the Celtics, spiritually, defensively, emotionally. And no matter how often Wilt reminded people about the stats, the championships never followed. In one infamous 1962 playoff series, Wilt averaged 33 points and 26 rebounds per game and lost. In 1965, Game 7 of the Eastern Division Finals came down to a single play, a turnover by Hal Greer and a steal by John Havlicek. And again, Russell walked away with the win. That game haunted Wilt for years, not because he had failed, but because even in moments where he didn't lose, the result felt the same. It wasn't just the losses, it was how the world viewed them. To the media, Russell was the noble champion. Wilt was the tragic genius. The implications stung. No matter what Wilt did, he would always be second best. Even if he scored 100, even if he grabbed 55 rebounds, even if he never fouled out of a single game in his entire career, which, by the way, he didn't. The pain wasn't just competitive, it was personal. Wilt and Russell had moments of friendship. They'd dined together, even spent Thanksgivings at each other's homes early on. But when the rivalry heated up, it fractured. Wilt accused Russell of questioning his character in the press. Russell denied it, but the damage lingered. For years, they didn't speak. It wasn't until the twilight of their lives that reconciliation came. Russell publicly said that Wilt was the most dominant player he had ever seen. And when Wilt passed away in 1999, Russell wept on camera. You could see the decades of battles in his eyes, not just as a competitor, but as a friend who knew the weight Wilt had carried. But during those prime years, Wilt hated that face, that number, 6 jersey, that stoic expression that seemed to mock his pain with every Boston win. Because no matter how many records he shattered, every time he looked at the banners in Boston Garden, they reminded him of the one thing he couldn't beat. If there was ever a player who blurred the line between rivalry and resentment for Wilt Chamberlain, it was Elgin Baylor. They were teammates, they were rivals, they were pioneers. And yet, Wilt never seemed fully comfortable in Baylor's orbit. Not because Baylor challenged him physically, but because he challenged his place in history, silently, effortlessly, almost like he didn't even care. When Chamberlain arrived in the NBA in 1959, Elgin Baylor was already one of the league's most electrifying scorers. He had dropped 55 points in a finals game before Wilt even played a postseason minute. Baylor didn't just score, he performed. He twisted through the air like a jazz solo, inventing layup angles that defied geometry. He was flash without arrogance, flair without ego. And for Wilt, who towered over defenders with raw, blunt force trauma that was both mesmerizing and maddening. Their careers ran parallel, but their reputations rarely did. Wilt was a headline. Baylor was a legacy. Wilt was the center of attention. Baylor was the soul of a franchise. And when their paths crossed in Los Angeles, everything got complicated. In 1968, Wilt was traded to the Lakers. He joined a team that already featured Jerry West and Elgin Baylor, 2 icons in their own right. But Wilt didn't want to blend in. He wanted to win his way. And from day one, there were whispers that Wilt was changing the offense, that Baylor's role was shrinking, that the chemistry was off. It wasn't outright hatred, but it was cold, stiff, calculated. The tension showed on the court. Wilt's scoring dropped dramatically with the Lakers. From 30 points a game to just over 20. He rebounded more, passed more, shot less. And Baylor, now well into his 30s, struggled with injuries and inconsistencies. The team won games, but not titles, and the pressure boiled over. Some blamed the coaching, others blamed injuries. But in the locker room, the unspoken truth lingered. Wilt and Elgin didn't fit. Not in personality, not in style, not in tempo. Elgin was a creative genius. Unpredictable, spontaneous, artistic. Wilt was a machine, efficient, powerful, demanding. On paper, they should have complemented each other. On the floor, they never quite synced, and Wilt felt it, felt the space Baylor occupied, not in the stat sheet, but in the hearts of Laker fans. This was Elgin's team before Wilt ever showed up. The Forum crowd had grown up on Baylor's balletic hang time, not Wilt's box score beatdowns. It wasn't that Wilt resented Baylor's talent. It was that Elgin never needed to say a word to own the room. He didn't bark, he didn't posture, he didn't need 100-point games or 20,000 anecdotes. He just played, and in a league full of talkers, Elgin's silence was deafening. There's one moment that symbolized everything. In 1971, after years of chasing a title, Elgin Baylor quietly announced his retirement just 9 games into the season. His knees were done. His body had given everything it could. The next game, the Lakers started a 33-game win streak, the longest in NBA history. They would go on to win the title that season, without Baylor and with Wilt. To the public, it was bittersweet. To Wilt, it was unsettling. Because deep down, Wilt knew what that meant. Baylor had spent 13 seasons carrying the Lakers through heartbreak, and the moment he walked away, they finally got over the hump. It wasn't Baylor's fault, but Wilt knew how that story would be told, that his championship came only after Baylor left, that he inherited a throne Elgin never got to sit on. Even years later, Wilt rarely mentioned Baylor in his lists of favorite teammates or opponents. He praised West. He spoke about Russell. He even reflected on Kareem. But Baylor? He was conspicuously absent from Wilt's pantheon. It wasn't open hostility, but it was cold. And maybe that's what made it worse. Because with Russell, there were battles. With Kareem, there was a passing of the torch. But with Baylor, there was no final duel, no defining moment. Just a quiet overlap. And Wilt hated being an afterthought to someone else's legacy, especially someone who never rubbed it in. Baylor never had to. He let the game speak for him, and for Wilt, that silence was the loudest insult of all. If there was one man who reminded Wilt Chamberlain that brute strength had company in the NBA, it was Walt Bellamy. Not because Bellamy outshined him, not because he stole headlines, but because Bellamy never played the role Wilt wanted his opponents to play. He didn't cower, didn't crack, didn't give Wilt the satisfaction of dominance. And for a man who fed off psychological submission as much as statistical superiority, that mattered. Walt Bellamy entered the league in 1961 and made his presence felt immediately. He averaged 31.6 points and 19.0 rebounds in his rookie season, second only to Wilt himself. In fact, Bellamy's rookie numbers remain some of the most absurd ever posted by a first-year player. He wasn't just productive, he was efficient. Long arms, soft touch, a natural rebounder with a deceptive first step. Bellamy was one of the few centers who could match Wilt's physicality without needing to mimic his theatrics. And that's what made Wilt hate playing him. Because Bellamy wasn't part of the show. He was a disruption. He wasn't there to admire Wilt's stat lines or stare at the scoreboard in disbelief. He was there to challenge him. And Chamberlain hated being challenged in silence. There's an often forgotten playoff matchup between the two from 1968 when Bellamy was on the Knicks and Wilt was with the Sixers. Bellamy held his ground, physically and mentally, in a bruising Eastern Division semifinal. Wilt still won the series, still dominated the glass, still piled up assists. But Bellamy didn't flinch. He didn't get baited into fouls, didn't give the press sound bites. He just showed up and played straight into Wilt's chest. It was basketball without spectacle, and for Wilt, who thrived on mythology, that was infuriating. What separated Bellamy from other big men was that he didn't seem impressed with anyone. He was famously stoic. You could elbow him in the ribs, hook him under the basket, body him for 40 minutes, and Bellamy would still look like he was deciding what to have for dinner. That unnerved Wilt. He wanted opponents to react, to gasp when he went up for a dunk, to stare when he kicked out a no-look pass. But Bellamy treated every play like a business transaction. You hit me, I hit you, no problem. Wilt didn't just want to win. He wanted to define the game. He wanted players to look back at their careers and say, I once shared the floor with Wilt Chamberlain. But Bellamy never played that part. In interviews, he rarely mentioned Wilt by name. He spoke about big matchups, but didn't indulge in mythology. Even when asked about Chamberlain decades later, Bellamy once responded dryly, we played. It was physical. I had some good nights. He had some better ones. That kind of detachment stung Wilt, whose ego required more than just respect. It craved reverence. It didn't help that Bellamy was statistically legitimate. Over his 14-year career, he averaged 20 points and 13 rebounds. He made 4 All-Star teams. He played in over 1,000 games. He had a soft, left-handed jumper and a bruising backdown style. In terms of raw size, he stood 6'11" and weighed 225 pounds, one of the few men who could hold ground against Chamberlain without being thrown around like luggage. And perhaps most frustratingly, Bellamy never chased Wilt's spotlight. He was content being overlooked. He didn't lobby for MVPs, didn't obsess over coverage. He just clocked in, clocked out, and walked home. That, more than anything, made him hard for Wilt to process, because it meant Bellamy played for something Wilt never truly understood, peace of mind. Whereas Wilt was obsessed with numbers, recognition, and rewriting history in ink, Bellamy was comfortable leaving it all in pencil. He didn't fight the narratives. He didn't try to control the headlines. He let his game speak, even if no one else was listening. Wilt, who saw the league as a chessboard and himself as the king, couldn't handle a piece that didn't move according to expectation. Walt Bellamy was that piece. And though their battles never reached the playoff drama of Wilt Russell or the generational tension of Wilt Kareem, they left a mark on Wilt. A reminder that not every war is won with stats. Some are lost in the silence between plays, in the space where legacy isn't shaped by dominance, but by disregard. In the long run, Wilt got the records. Bellamy got the quiet. But in Wilt's mind, maybe that's what stung the most. Because even when he beat Walt Bellamy, he never really shook him. If there was one man Wilt Chamberlain couldn't bully, physically, emotionally, or statistically, it was Nate Thurmond. Not Bill Russell, not Kareem, not Willis Reed. Nate Thurmond. Because Thurmond didn't just defend Wilt, he absorbed him. He didn't gamble, didn't foul out, didn't backpedal or complain to the refs. He just stood there, arms wide, legs planted, with a look that said, you're going to have to earn every single inch. And that made Wilt furious. This wasn't hate rooted in off-court beef or media rivalry. This was something quieter, more primal. The kind of hate that builds over 40 minutes of leaning, pushing, elbowing, and realizing, this guy isn't going away, ever. Thurmond entered the league in 1963, just as Wilt was beginning his reign of statistical terror. At 6 feet 11 inches, 250 pounds, with absurd wingspan and a base like a statue carved from granite, Nate was the rare big man who welcomed physical punishment. He didn't shy from Wilt's spin moves or fadeaways. He leaned in. The matchups between the two became folklore, even among players. Jerry West once said, Nate Thurmond was the toughest center I ever played with or against. He could guard anyone, even Wilt. That wasn't hyperbole. That was truth, born from watching two of the strongest men in basketball history slam into each other night after night with no give. Wilt once dropped 100 points on the Knicks. He averaged 50 a game in a season. He once put up 73 points with a flu. But when he faced Nate, it wasn't the same story. In their head-to-head matchups, Wilt's scoring often dropped dramatically. There were games where Chamberlain finished with 15, 18, 22, respectable for a normal big man, but for Wilt, practically invisible, because Thurmond didn't try to block everything. He contained. He boxed. He neutralized. His defense was more chess than sprint. Subtle footwork, perfectly timed hands, and the rare psychological discipline to never bite on Wilt's mind games. And those mind games, they mattered. Because Wilt didn't just play basketball, he imposed it. He ran laps before games to intimidate. He palmed teammates' heads in warm-ups. He'd throw a hook shot off glass, rebound it, dunk it, and stare at you the entire time. That stuff worked on most people, not Thurmond. He didn't flinch, didn't react, didn't play the theater. In fact, Wilt once admitted in an interview, through gritted teeth, you couldn't move Nate. And for Wilt Chamberlain, a man who moved everybody, that admission was as close to a surrender as he'd ever give. The friction wasn't just physical, it was existential. Wilt was a man of dominance. Nate was a man of resistance. Chamberlain loved to calculate and manipulate matchups. He'd size up weaker defenders, attack them early, and pull back once he had his 30 and 20 by halftime. But against Nate, there was no pulling back, because he might not even get 20. You could feel the tension in the air every time they met, especially in the playoffs. In the 1967 Western Division Finals, Wilt's Sixers faced Thurmond's Warriors. The media played it up as a battle of titans, and it didn't disappoint. In Game 3, Nate forced Wilt into one of his lowest-scoring playoff games ever. The stats don't tell the full story. Wilt still rebounded, still passed, but he had to work for everything. Every rebound, every seal, every pivot, all with Thurmond's chest in his ribs and forearms under his chin. And even when Wilt's team won the series, Thurmond's impact lingered. Because Wilt thrived on dominance, psychological warfare, conditioning opponents into collapse. But you can't dominate what won't bend. And Nate Thurmond never bent. Years later, when both men had retired, Wilt was asked about the toughest defenders he ever faced. He gave credit to Russell, out of necessity, but when pressed, he paused, thought for a moment, then said softly, Nate. He was something else. The only guy who made me feel tired. That wasn't respect. That was residual annoyance. Because Wilt didn't hate Nate Thurmond for anything Nate said. He hated him for what he refused to become. He wouldn't be part of the show. Wouldn't admire Wilt's records. Wouldn't play the role of secondary giant. He just stood there, 48 minutes a night, and refused to be moved. And for a man who moved mountains, that was the most frustrating thing of all. If there was ever a moment that captured Wilt Chamberlain's deepest frustration, it wasn't the 100-point game. It wasn't the playoff collapses. It was Game 7 of the 1970 NBA Finals. And at the center of it was Willis Reed, not the biggest, not the flashiest. But on that night, in that building, Reed became the symbol of everything Wilt couldn't control. The setup was cinematic. Madison Square Garden, Knicks versus Lakers, series tied 3-3, a title on the line. And just hours before tip-off, news breaks. Willis Reed, the Knicks captain, is doubtful to play. He'd torn a thigh muscle in Game 5, missed Game 6. Most expected him to sit. But then the tunnel moment happened. A limping Reed emerged from the shadows, dragging his leg onto the court during warm-ups. The garden erupted. Wilt looked up. The cameras locked in. This was the storyline now, and that's when the hate was sealed. Because Reed didn't have to be dominant that night. He just had to exist, show up, to hit 2 mid-range jumpers in the opening minutes. That was it. That was all. But the Knicks fed off it like it was oxygen. And Wilt, he disappeared. In that game, Game 7 of the NBA Finals, Chamberlain attempted just 9 shots. 9. For a man who'd once averaged over 39 shot attempts per game, it was like watching Goliath drop the sling and walk away. Reed's stat line? 4 points, 3 rebounds. Barely played, but his presence broke the game. And that was the kind of thing Wilt hated most. Not the physical battles. He could win those. But the emotional ones? The narratives, the moments when the story got bigger than him, that's where Reed lived. Their rivalry wasn't always mythic. In the regular season, Wilt usually got his numbers. He dropped 25 and 20 without blinking, but Reed made him earn every bucket. He was 6 feet 10 inches, but wide, strong, unrelenting, like a wall with elbows. He wasn't afraid to body Wilt up, to give hard fouls, to take one in the ribs and keep playing. He didn't back down, and for Wilt, a man who overwhelmed, intimidated, dominated, that was unforgivable. Because with Reed, there was no fear, there was only resistance. And then came 1972. Wilt finally got his ring with the Lakers, beat Reed and the Knicks in the finals, avenged the loss. But you wouldn't know it by listening to him. Because even in victory, Wilt's tone around Reed was cold. He rarely gave Reed the kind of respect he gave Russell, or Thurmond, or even Kareem. Instead, he'd deflect, say Reed was good, not great, suggest he was overhyped, that the media turned him into a folk hero. But deep down, Wilt knew what happened in Game 7. He knew he let the moment slip. Reed, playing on one leg, won the war of willpower. And for a man obsessed with physical dominance, that kind of loss was unbearable. There were subtler layers too. Reed represented the team first, blue-collar ethos Wilt always struggled with. Willis didn't chase numbers, didn't complain about coaches, didn't write tell-all books throwing teammates under the bus. He just played, took charges, rotated on defense, set hard screens, and won. In 1973, Reed and the Knicks beat Wilt again in the finals, this time decisively. Wilt retired after that season. The two never developed a friendship. They weren't close, didn't appear at reunions together, and you got the sense, even decades later, that Wilt had never forgiven Reed for taking the spotlight that night in 1970. Because the truth is, Wilt hated what Reed represented. He hated that a man on one leg could shift the energy of an entire building. He hated that presence sometimes mattered more than points. He hated that history remembered Reed's limp more than Wilt's stats. Because for all his records, the 100 points, the 50-point average, the 55 rebounds, Wilt couldn't control that memory. And for a man who built his legacy on being unchallengeable, that was the one challenge he couldn't erase. For Wilt Chamberlain, the numbers were never enough. Not against Reed, not against Russell, not when the moment slipped through his fingers and someone else became the legend. And in a league filled with pride, pain, and unspoken grudges, he wasn't the only one carrying that weight. Because Allen Iverson, one of the most fearless guards the game has ever seen, had his own list, a list of 6 players he never forgot and never forgave. Tap here to find out who made his list of rivals he hated most. Please do not forget to like the video and share your thoughts in the comments section, and also subscribe to the channel for more videos.